Okay, everybody, it's good to see everybody joining us today. I'm going to get started since we wanted to be prompt at 11:40. And I will be your host and moderator. My name is Adam Green. I'm a professor of biology and environmental science at Santa Barbara City College. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of kind of the timeline, how we're going to do this, and some basic instructions so you know how to navigate the webinar. So first for the timeline, we'll do a bit of an introduction, and part of that will be a 12-minute introduction video. One thing about the video, just because of the nature of the webinar, is how smooth the video operates and how you see it is dependent on your connection speed and your connection. So that's nothing we can, if it is a little glitchy on your end, unfortunately, that's not much we can do about that part of it. Just know that it's also posted on our website. So if you wish to see, if you do have problems with that intro video for any reason, you can go there and see it directly from YouTube. So we'll do the introduction. We'll have a 12-minute introduction video that talks a little bit about our Santa Barbara Ecological and Edible Garden Project, for which this event is part of. It's an EPA grant-funded project. Then I will introduce our speakers, and you have two great speakers today. Charis Heide, who is a biologist, research biologist, and environmental consultant, has done a lot of work in the Santa Barbara area, and very pleased to have her here because she's actually now moved to the Netherlands and is joining us. And she's done a ton of work on the monarchs in our area, and so she'll be doing a talk on the Western monarch population. And then we'll have time for Q&A for her talk, and then we'll have Denise Knapp, who is the head of conservation at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, and she'll talk more about pollinator ecology, native bees, and a lot of their interactions with some of our native plant species. And both will also be including components about what we can do in our own landscapes to help support these populations. One thing I want to mention about the audience is broad. We have people joining us that are everything from young students all the way up to professional biologists. So we will do our best to try to hit the sweet spot in terms of terminology and level of detail, but feel free, of course, to ask questions. So with regard to that, you cannot turn on or adjust your camera. The speakers will not be able to see you. That's a setting for this webinar. So the only way you can communicate to us is through the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the window. So if you're seeing the window, you're seeing me, you look at the bottom there, you see all the different icons that are pretty typical of a Zoom session. And you'll see one of them that says Q&A. It's probably right next to participants for most everybody. That is how you will be able to ask questions of us and of the speakers. Is you click on that, you will type in your question. And then the way it's going to operate is that there's two of us that will look through the questions, myself and Rachel Johnson, who's kind enough to assist us with this. She's from the Santa Barbara City College Foundation, and she is our grant manager and grant writer for this project. And we're going to then, she's going to transfer those questions into a Google Doc and group them so that when the Q&A session starts, we can be efficient in the questions that we're asking of the speakers. And the way it'll work is I will read the question off to the speaker, and then the speaker will be able to respond verbally to the question so that everybody can hear it, because otherwise you would not see the different questions that others are asking. Any questions we're not able to answer during the event, we will try to post on the website. And you can see the website address above me here. And we will repeat that several times. But then you may be able to get answers to those questions from the website. We'll put it in as a text response, for example, because we want to try to address everybody's questions that have them. So what I will, the other thing that is important to understand is this event is being entirely closed captioned. So if you go down to, again, the bottom, and there's a closed caption icon down there, so you can click on that if you wish to be able to see the closed captioning. And the entire event is being recorded, and so it will be posted on YouTube, and we will link it to the website. Again, the one that's up here. So if you want to watch it again or send it to somebody, or if somebody you know wasn't able to make the event and which wishes to see the event, they will be able to see it in its entirety. And my hope is too to also clip it up into segments so that if you wish to just, for example, see a particular speaker for the shorter time period, to be able to do that as well. All right, so without further ado, Clyde, can you please play our intro video? Thank you. Santa Barbara is primarily an agricultural county with coastal communities that depend on a robust tourist industry. We also sit within the California Floristic Province, which is one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. We have that distinction due to the combination of high plant species diversity, many of which occur nowhere else in the world, and high levels of threat due to a large human population. Our chaparral and oak woodland ecosystems are among the most threatened in the world, mostly due to habitat loss from agricultural and urban development. Our region is experiencing higher than average warming, increased drought frequency and severity, and increased wildfire frequency and intensity. Recent reports have concluded that we have experienced an enormous loss of biomass and biodiversity among North American birds and temperate zone insects in particular. Native pollinators are in decline, and the vast majority of bees found pollinating both native and crop plants in the Santa Barbara region are non-native European honeybees that may be adversely affecting native bee populations. The precipitous loss of monarch butterfly populations in the West is not just an ecological tragedy, it also affects our local tourism industry. As a coastal marine ecosystem, Santa Barbara is experiencing and contributing to the interacting impacts of runoff pollution, warming ocean temperatures, and increasing ocean acidification, the latter happening at an alarming rate. These impacts affect our major economic sectors of tourism and commercial fishing. Like many coastal urban systems, Santa Barbara's impermeable surfaces prevent infiltration, and the short rainy season creates plumes of coastal pollution that include sediment, bacteria, nutrients, heavy metals, trash, and oil. Much of the pollution comes from what we call non-point sources, difficult to control and eliminate. Finally, despite an often held misconception that Santa Barbara is a wealthy community, we suffer from high levels of food insecurity among families and students. Each of these challenges is daunting. Combined, they can be overwhelming. What if we could contribute less to the problem and become part of the solution in our very own gardens? What if these gardens created spaces that restored critical habitat and supported native pollinators? What if they built and protected healthy soil that stored carbon, decreasing the rate of climate disruption, and trapped runoff, decreasing coastal pollution? What if they grew healthy, local, fresh produce for communities that need it most, served as gathering places to connect and learn about local ecosystems, the growing of food, and the interconnection between them? What if these spaces educated our children and made them citizen scientists, learning about the critical role of native species and collecting data on their populations? What if these gardens were spread among schools, places of worship, residential yards, and community centers, creating a network for multiple generations of people to gather and learn together? What if this network created an archipelago of habitat islands supporting native species on a larger scale? Well, if like us, you are tired of the what ifs, then why don't we just do it? Thanks to an environmental education grant from the EPA, we created the Santa Barbara Ecological and Edible Garden Program. With this program, we hope to create and support a network of gardens that achieve all those what ifs I just described. Let's meet our core team and learn more about what we're doing.
Hi, my name is Daniel Parra-Hensel. I'm an adjunct faculty in the Environmental Horticulture Department here at Santa Barbara City College, and I'm one of the co-leads for the Santa Barbara Ecological Edible Gardens program. I oversee the permaculture program. We run a couple programs, courses, an introduction to permaculture, an advanced applied permaculture, and developing some courses with non-credit to do hands-on ecological landscape design work. We get to go out into these community gardens and actually design and then implement some of the elements and the features that get us to these desirable outcomes or functions, which are things like biodiversity, pollinator habitat, soil quality and quantity. So soil organic matter increases, we get more retention of water for longer times, we get less pest problems in the plants. Food development, we're growing culturally relevant crops for communities to have nutrient-dense food, for them to have a more sustained diet. These are some of the really great benefits that these kind of ecological and edible gardens that we're designing and implementing, those are some of the objectives that we'll be monitoring and looking at to see if we can reach with this grant program. What excites me the most about this particular project is the relationship between applied ecology and our social justice lens that we're applying to these community gardens. We're getting to work with a lot of communities that historically haven't really had access to a lot of this information, to the sort of environmental and ecological principles that are often taught. And so we're getting to build trust and relationships with communities that have been a part of the Santa Barbara community from the beginning, but aren't always included in these processes. So we're working with the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens, we're working with Mesa Harmony Gardens, we're working with El Centro Somos Semillas Garden, we're working with the Santa Barbara Lower West Side Boys and Girls Club. And so those are very unique, diverse populations, stakeholders, community members, and all of those have different parts in which they play a role in sort of our movement towards ecological justice, ecological design, sustainability, regenerative design, all these great things that really we're looking to do with the Santa Barbara community here, and our role as a city college, as a community-oriented college, to be relevant to the larger community.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Johnson, Executive Director of Explore Ecology. We are proud partners in the SBEE Garden Project.
And I'm Marla Greer, a School Garden Coordinator for Explore Ecology.
Explore Ecology's School Garden Program is one of many programs that Explore Ecology operates. We are a nonprofit in Santa Barbara County focused on environmental education, and our School Gardens program consists of about 30 elementary schools and one junior high school garden, where we educate the students about organic gardening, composting, healthy food choices, and a whole bunch of other topics. We're really excited about this partnership because it allows us to have the opportunity to connect our gardens program to the larger school communities as well as the larger Santa Barbara community. So through this project, we are able to engage students at 6 schools in Santa Barbara County in citizen science projects, which are really exciting. So our garden educators are able to work with the students at each of these school sites. Our garden educators that are experts in everything organic gardening and outdoor education get to help develop these programs that will happen within the other community gardens.
So our garden educators are amazing. They put together these lessons that relate back to what students have been learning in their classrooms. So now they have a hands-on application to reinforce what they've already been learning. And to see the students' growth and their retention of this knowledge and their excitement really is the best part. To see them get excited about science, get excited about food, get excited to get dirty and hold a worm and build compost is really amazing. I can remember one time having a class taste pomegranates for the first time. First time some of these kids have ever tasted a fresh pomegranate, seen the seeds pop out. And the next time I saw that class, some of the students asked me, like, what is this called again? How can I find it? Where can I get it? I wanna, you know, have my parents eat this. I wanna show them what it's all about. I really believe that this is an experience that will be a lasting impact on these students.
Hello, I'm Adam Green. I'm a professor of biology and environmental science at Santa Barbara City College, and I'm one of the leads of the Santa Barbara Ecological and Edible Garden Project. Now we know that creating an ecologically based food-producing garden is not a new idea. This is a system that's been around for thousands of years. Quite possibly the very first way that we did agriculture was to farm nature. What we're doing here is kind of recreating and mimicking that type of system. You may have heard of the term food forest. And the idea behind that is we're, in essence, mimicking forest ecosystems, and in the process, also growing food that we can use. These gardens produce a lot of things that are beneficial to us. They produce the food, but they also regenerate habitat. They support biodiversity. They build up healthy soil. And the fact that we can also grow local, fresh, organic produce, something that's also of critical need to surrounding communities, that's just yet one more massive benefit to these types of systems. There's a lot of different organizations and groups that have been doing this, and we wanted to help these groups to really interconnect, to learn from each other, to help support each other, to create a more resilient system that was going to be here in the long term and really benefit this community. We want to invite you to be part of this project. We want you to be able to visit and support your community gardens, to support the School Gardens program, to grow your own garden if that's what you want to do. Visit our website. It's hosted by Explore Ecology. It's going to have loads of resources on that for you to be able to learn about these types of garden systems. You'll be able to see the upcoming events that we're going to host, speakers that are going to speak about everything from local biodiversity to food sovereignty. Help support this network. This is something that truly has a value to it. It's beautiful, it's functional. It helps us get outside. It helps us get our hands in the soil, growing plants, producing our own food. It helps address some of these massive issues like climate disruption and biodiversity loss, pollution, and food insecurity. And we can do it by being outside with our kids in the sun, enjoying life. If we do this right, we make our community more beautiful and more resilient, and we leave something truly valuable to our children and to their children. All right, so that's a little bit of an intro to what we're about and what our project is doing. And of course, part of that project is community education, and that's where these events play a role, and why we're bringing these great speakers to the community so that you guys can learn a little bit more about this type of gardening system, but also connect more with growing our own food, where our food comes from, and also some of the ecological components of the species that are around us. So we're going to move in now to the main part of the event, which is our speakers. And we're really very lucky to have the speakers that we have here today, because we're really dealing with some very important issues here with an overall decline of insects globally, both in terms of species and in terms of biomass. And locally, some really important groups, both for ecosystem, the functioning of ecosystem services, and also some of our basic aspects of kind of quality of life and tourism. So Charis Vanderheide is going to talk to us about the monarch butterfly Western population and some of the hypotheses associated with why we've seen such a dramatic decline in this population, what might be some of the causes for that, what might be some ways that we might be able to support them in our own landscapes. Just as a reminder, the way you can ask questions, and you can ask them throughout the talk. The speaker will not see your questions. They will not stop and answer them during the talk. They will complete their entire talk without interruption. And then at the end of that, we will read the questions off for the speaker to be able to answer. So use that Q&A button that's at the bottom of the window to ask your questions. We'll filter through those and try to be as efficient as we can with the questions in terms of which ones we choose and ask them of our speakers. And again, just a reminder, anything we can't get to or maybe don't have an immediate answer for, we will try to answer on the website, again, that you can see above my head there. And again, the event is being closed captioned. If you would like to see the closed captioning, just look at, again, the bottom of the window. There's a closed captioning insignia down there, an icon that you can click on so that you can see the closed captioning. And everything that we're doing is being recorded so that you can see it later or send it to somebody. And that will also be linked to our website. Okay, so without further ado, I will turn this over to Charis Vanderheide, who's a research biologist and environmental consultant, and is currently coming to us from the Netherlands. despite having being a clear Santa Barbara native and have done an amazing amount of work on monarch butterflies, monarch populations, and has been gracious enough to work with me in the past with my students. So she's done everything from data collection and research to education and community outreach. So thank you again, Charis, and take it away.
Yes, thank you very much, Adam. Let's see. Okay, so are my slides going to come up? Okay, here we are. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what happened to the Western monarch butterfly. So next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief description to get everyone on the same page of the monarch migration through North America. So in North America, there's two general populations of the monarchs. There's the eastern monarchs, which are east of the Rocky Mountains and generally fly down to the forests in Mexico. And then the western butterflies west of the Rocky Mountains fly to the coast of California for the winter. And there is some crossover between Arizona and Mexico, but for the most part, there are these two populations, and I'm going to be talking mainly about the western population. So next slide. Okay, so monarch butterflies come to the coast of California to overwinter. They start arriving in October and have historically departed around March, although we're seeing that they are more trending to leave in January, which I will talk more about later. But from the overwintering sites, they fly north and east to breed across the West, and typically take 4 generations to expand outwards to the full extent of their breeding range. And in this figure, the Y1 through Y4 are the approximate stages of each generation in the spring migration. And each of these butterflies lives about 1 month. And then in the fall, when the milkweed starts senescing and the temperatures start to cool, these last fall generation monarchs fly south and west together to the coast of California. And these monarchs, the ones that migrate, will live up to 8 months through the winter, and then they will leave in early spring and lay eggs and start the next generation for the spring to continue the spring migration. So in a full year, there's 4 to 5 generations of monarchs. Okay, next slide. So briefly about the Western monarch Thanksgiving count. This is a volunteer organization that started in 1997 when a group of monarch biologists noticed that the population of monarchs had started to decline, and they needed a standardized method to monitor the population. So monarch volunteers survey as many of the 400 overwintering sites in California every November and January. And our knowledge of the Western monarch population is due to the efforts of hundreds of these volunteers. And for the past several, maybe decade, I've been coordinating the Western monarch Thanksgiving count for Santa Barbara County and training volunteers and counting a bunch of the sites together with these volunteers. So here's have from the Western monarch Thanksgiving count, and you can see that the population fluctuates from year to year, and this is quite common for insect populations. The blue line in this graph is the number of sites that are counted each year, and then the green bars is the count of the monarch, the number of individuals that were counted. And so you can see that there's been a general decline in the numbers, and then the last 3 years here in 2018, 19, and 2020 have been the lowest that we've seen yet. So next slide. So to set the scene a little bit for what happened, Cheryl Schultz at the Washington State University and her colleagues published a paper in 2017 on their population viability analysis of the Western monarchs. And they estimated the quasi-extinction threshold to be about 30,000 butterflies. So this means that if the migrating population dips below this number, then theoretically there would not be enough individuals to find each other to mate once they disperse and then continue the population for the next breeding season. Next slide. So in 2018, unfortunately, we had the chance to observe this theory play out right in front of us because the Thanksgiving count yielded a total of 25,253 monarchs. So below the 30,000 threshold theory. So this was shocking because it was only 17% of monarchs from the previous year in 2017. And we could see this in the field in real time. There were sites that we counted that in 2017 had 1,000 monarchs and in 2018 had 100. So right away we knew something was going on. And then we learned that that was the trend throughout the state. And so the population in 2019 was about the same, and we got a little bit optimistic, maybe they're going to recover. But then in 2020, we saw another drastic decline with less than 2,000 individuals. So this was only 9% of the previous year in 2019 population. And so many of the sites in 2020 had zeros. And so as saddening as that is to find a zero, it's still a really important data point for volunteers to report because it's different from just a blank. It's a zero and it's important. So, and the highest count that I saw in 2020 was 50 butterflies, and that was at a site on the Gaviota Coast, which, I mean, it was just shocking in so many ways. So we know that the decline started in the spring of 2018 from data that the Xerces Society had collected. So in 2017, they had started the Western Monarch Breeding Phenology Program and monitored breeding sites throughout California. And so in the spring of 2018, they found a remarkable decline in the number of eggs and caterpillars at their sites compared to 2017. And they documented the constriction of the breeding range. And they also found that the density of the monarch eggs and larvae had a 10-fold decline between those 2 years. And then in the spring and summer of 2019, there were almost no butterflies in Oregon and Nevada, and the monarchs just didn't reach the breeding habitat in most of their western range or in the masses that they were used to. So next slide. So this means that we are left with 0.01% of the population estimated in the 1980s. And the Xerces Society created this graphic just to illustrate just how drastic this crash is. So next slide. So what is causing this decline? So there's habitat loss, habitat destruction, pesticides, herbicides have played a large part in the decline for years. But we're thinking that climate change and changing weather patterns are the main cause for this recent drastic decline. So we're experiencing warmer temperatures in fall and January, which are critical times when the monarchs use temperature cues for their migration cycle. Next slide. So warmer autumn temperatures impact monarchs as well as all other butterflies in the West. Matt Forrester's lab and the University of Nevada found that warming autumns is the main cause for the decline of a number of butterfly species, including the monarchs across the West. So warmer and drier autumns mean that the monarchs may not receive the environmental cues that they need to initiate that fall migration and trigger a diapause and migration. So they go into this diapause where they put their reproduction on hold in the fall, and that gives them the energy that they need to sustain that longer life, that shift from living 1 month to living 8 months through the winter. So warming temperatures can influence that chemical shift. And so also warmer means drier. So they may not have enough milkweed resources across the West in the drier autumns to sustain another summer or late fall generation. So these factors mean higher mortality in the fall. And so we're also seeing warming Januaries. And so when they're at their overwintering sites, a warmer January that we've seen in the last 3 years means that they are can likely breaking out of their overwintering dormancy, and we're seeing them leave the overwintering sites earlier. And so this means that where they have typically waited until March, they're now leaving in January. And that means that they're now leaving and looking for milkweed across the landscape that may not be emerging yet on the landscape. Milkweed can emerge and germinate around February or March, sometimes as late as April. So that means there's 2 or 3 months where they're not protected at their overwintering sites and they're not able to lay eggs. And compound that with the more frequent and extreme spring storms that we're getting means that they're not protected and there's a higher mortality in the spring. And that they're susceptible to freezing temperatures in the spring freezes and inland when they're away from the coast. So compound all these factors together and you end up with the lowest migrating numbers we've ever seen. So next slide. So what does this all mean? It means that we'll likely lose our migrating population in the West. And the monarchs' range is then constricted to resident populations in temperate areas of California. And so the impacts of the loss of migration means that there's very few monarchs outside of California where the temperatures dip below freezing. Okay, next slide. So where do monarchs fit in the community? So interestingly enough, monarchs make very poor pollinators. They're so efficient with their long legs and their long proboscis that they just don't pick up the pollen the way a bee does. So they're not great pollinators, but they are a great food source for a great many birds and insects and invertebrates. So this means that less than 1% of eggs reach adulthood, which means there's a high rate of predation. And so a study recently reported video surveillance of 10 taxa of nocturnal arthropods prey on monarch eggs and larvae. So in the food web, the decline of a prey species can lead to a cascading effect up the food web and a decline in the predator species. So moving on, next slide. So what can we do for the monarchs? First of all, if it's climate related, then we can reduce our carbon and stop climate change, right? That's easy enough. No, okay, that's big. But moving on, what we can do in our gardens, next slide. is, okay, so beyond this, the Xerces Society has pulled together the Western Monarch Call to Action, which are a list of actions and where those actions can be applied in California. So number one, we have protect and manage overwintering sites. So this is big because currently in California, there is no consistent protection for overwintering sites. So we can advocate at local, regional, and state levels to ensure that these sites are legally protected. We are still seeing the destruction of overwintering habitats and for development, and then also the recent droughts that we've had have destroyed most of the trees, and we see trees still dying at overwintering sites. And so these sites are sensitive because cutting one tree or one tree falling or even trimming a few branches can change the microclimate enough for the monarchs to find them less suitable. So increasing the amount of habitat management plans that we have for these overwintering sites would help. And also an interesting factor about this is until now, until this decline, we've used the presence of monarchs at overwintering sites to define overwintering habitat. So that means that protecting these sites will become more challenging without the presence of monarchs to prove that these sites are important, or even to prove that it is a site or it was a site. So our historical records are going to become much more valuable, but it'll mean that it's just going to become more harder to define new overwintering habitat and protect that. Next slide. So two, we can restore breeding and migratory habitat in California. So this means in your gardens, if you're along the coast, you can plant winter flowering plants where the monarchs are during the winter, and then away from the coast, you can plant summer flowering nectar species to support their migration. And it also means planting milkweed, and specifically native milkweed. So planting native milkweed in the right place is going to be key. The Xerces Society has recommended to plant native milkweed 5 miles away from the coast, away from overwintering sites. But they've since adjusted this to 1 mile away from overwintering sites. And the discussion around where to plant milkweed and native milkweed is linked to a protozoan parasite called OE. It has a much longer scientific name, but we've shortened it to OE. So this parasite weakens or kills monarchs, and it passes from the female to the egg. And it can persist on tropical milkweed plants that don't lose their leaves over the winter and don't go into a dormancy. And so native milkweed plants go into a natural dormancy. So we're promoting native milkweed to help stop the spread of this protozoan parasite. And there's a lot of research about this on the eastern population. So I'll talk about what's going on in the eastern population. So over the summer, the percentage of infected individuals grows quickly as the population expands through the breeding range. Then in the fall, during the migration south to Mexico, the weak individuals, or the infected individuals, are mostly too weak to make the trip. So the population arriving in Mexico has a relatively low infection rate. And this is called migratory culling, where the process of clearing the infection by migration. So then the cycle in the spring begins again with a relatively healthy population. So applying this concept to the Western population is a bit tricky if breeding populations and our breeding habitat is in the same place as overwintering habitat, and we also don't have enough data or research to really understand how migratory culling occurs in the Western population. But we know that if there's no migratory culling, that the OE infection can spread rapidly through the population. And we know this from the resident population in Florida, that the non-migratory population can have a really high infection rate. Okay, so essentially, we don't want fields of milkweed close to overwintering sites, but I think a few milkweed plants in your Santa Barbara garden or in your school is just fine, because I think that personal connection to the milkweed and the monarchs and the eggs and the caterpillars, and watching that process, is important for us to connect to it, for our kids to see, for education. So I wouldn't discourage that. I would just limit it to a few plants right along the coast where the monarch overwintering sites are, and then expanding breeding and milkweed growth away from the coast. But we also think that milkweed is not the limiting factor for the monarch decline. It's more climate related. Okay, 3, protect monarchs in their habitat, protects monarchs and their habitat from pesticides. So often large nurseries will treat their plants, and especially their milkweed, with pesticides. So from organic nurseries, or grow nectar and milkweed plants from organic seed. Also advocate to limit the use of pesticides and herbicides, and buy organic and support local organic farms and school gardens and everything that this program's about. Okay, 4, protect, manage, and restore breeding, summer breeding, and fall migration monarch habitat outside of California. That's very similar. We'll move on. Number 5, answer key research questions about how best to aid the Western monarch recovery. So this is something very tangible that you guys can participate in right now. There's the Western Monarch Mystery Challenge. And this is where, if you see a monarch, you take a picture, even if it's a blurry picture, and you post it to their website and their email. Just Google Western Monarch Mystery Challenge. And this helps to fill an interesting data gap where we're trying to figure out where monarchs go when they leave overwintering sites. Where are they in that early spring period? So it's happening right now. And then you can win prizes, and it's very exciting. Okay. Moving on, next slide. Okay, so what can we do in our gardens? Well, this is a garden program, so there's so many resources about what you can do in your gardens. This is just one resource, 100 plants to save the monarchs. And then there's a sign that you can use to post that you have habitat and to protect it from pesticides and to label it as important. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is heavy stuff, but I think there are still reasons for hope. I think we can find hope in evolutionary biology. Monarchs are a highly mobile, highly adaptable species. So maybe I wonder if these individuals that are left in the migratory population somehow, hopefully, have the right genetic variability to become more resilient and more resistant to the environmental changes and the increasing extreme temperatures that we're seeing. Maybe they'll be able to build a stronger, more resilient population in the West moving forward. We are also seeing that there's signs of increased breeding in Arizona and Utah this spring. And this means that the Western population could be influenced by monarchs coming from Mexico and from the Eastern population. So we could see an influx to the West from the more robust Eastern population. And we still have so much more to learn. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Charis. Sometimes we go, yay, this is amazing. And then other times we go, oh, we got to hang our head in shame because this is a devastating results.
cry.
And it's, yeah, I think, Charis and I have been kind of joking around that a lot of biologists need a support group when they're sitting around and watching their study species go into such a drastic decline. And just since I've been here in 2004, I remember early on, we counted as many as 50,000 monarchs just at the Elwood, Maine congregation site. And now to see, just a couple thousand in the entire Western population really is devastating. So I will put out some questions, and some of you've already addressed, but there is a general question again for those of us on the coast, that planting of the milkweed. And just to kind of re-summarize that, your suggestion is we don't have to not plant some native milkweed, but maybe we stop short of planting massive amounts of it. And, the key being focusing on the native milkweed rather than the non-native tropical milkweeds that maintain their leaves throughout the entire year. Has there been any work or any discussion about local genotypes? So the idea being not only having the native species, but also potentially, has there been any thought or effect of local genotypes that are adapted to a particular region?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of push to promote the Asclepias californica, which is one of the early emerging milkweed species. It's one of the first to emerge, and as I talked about, that if monarchs are leaving earlier in January, they're going to start needing milkweed earlier and earlier. But from what I understand from the Xerces Society, finding local genotypes of Asclepias californica is rare. It's hard to find. So they're working on making this species more readily commercially available, and also pay very close attention to local genotypes, that where the seed came from and where it came from. So I know there's work on that. Yes.
And so there's been also a couple of questions about providing links for some of this information. So I just want to let everybody know that we may not be able to track it down right now in real time and put it in the chat, but we will get those links. We'll put them on a document that you can access through the website. And one thing I will also
westernmonarchcount.org is a really good resource for the Western Monarch Thanksgiving count. All the data is there. They have resources there. And then that links back to the Xerces Society website with that book that you can find in their store. So,
yeah. And so as people are planning, let's say you're planning a garden, you want to do this the right way, would you still suggest that maybe if you're right on the coastline, like a lot of us in Santa Barbara and some others that are joining us, to focus a bit more on the nectar producing plants for us that would be more of a food source for the monarch as a butterfly, as opposed to breeding habitat for the caterpillars?
Yes, and specifically winter flowering native plants, or not even native, but winter flowering is going to make that nectar available when the monarchs are wintering, and then a little bit farther away from the overwintering sites start promoting more native milkweed. But as I said, the having a few milkweed plants in your garden, I think, is good just for that human connection, because we can't lose that.
Mm-hmm. And some have asked that, if you do, for example, have tropical milkweed, is it just better to then kind of just cut it back during the winter so that it can't be used, or it wouldn't allow for the increase in the parasite population?
Yes, yeah. Cutting it back around in November and then letting it regrow in January would be ideal, especially because you cut it back, you get rid of those leaves that could have the OE from the previous season. And also if you're curious, if the monarchs in your yard have OE, you can, I think it's monarchhealth.org, but I'll find that too, because you can Google Monarch Health and you get an insurance company sometimes. So, but monarchhealth.org is the University of Georgia, and you can request a sample kit, and they'll send you this kit where if the milkweed or if the monarch hatches out or emerges from the chrysalis and you can grab it, then you can very efficiently and without harming the butterfly, collect a little sample and then send that back to them, and they'll look at it under a microscope and tell you if your butterflies are infected. And that's just something for you to know. I think it's important.
Okay, great. So for the sake of keeping us on a time schedule, I'm going to move on to Denise Knapp's talk, but know that once she's finished, we'll also have additional Q&A time. First, we'll prioritize it for Denise's information, but then we'll open it up for questions for both speakers and also the project in general. So I know there's a few of you that have asked some questions that we haven't gotten to yet, but we hope to get to those before the end of the event. And again, if we don't, we'll post some responses on our website. So again, just a reminder, use that Q&A icon in there. I'm seeing questions coming in, which is great. That's an efficient way for us to then cull through those and ask our speakers. And I want to again thank Charis for giving us this information and joining us from the Netherlands and doing that and doing all, I mean, she's just been doing years and years of work, counting, tracking, researching the monarchs and working on, now you're working on habitat management plans for them.
Yeah.
So we owe you a debt, and hopefully, and one question I'll leave with you to think about for after when we get to the general Q&A is if anybody would ever consider captively breeding and reintroducing monarchs. But I won't let you answer that now. I'll let you think on that one. So next up, we have Denise Knapp. And Denise is the head of conservation at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And she's kind of an ecologist extraordinaire, does a lot of work with how native pollinators interact with native plant species, and has really done some interesting stuff on what types of plants need to be available to support native pollinator species and vice versa. And so she'll give us a great overview of the native pollinators, native bees, their ecology, and also some of the things that we can do in our own landscapes to support these populations. All right, take it away, Denise.
All right, here I am. Thanks, Adam, so much. I'm really happy to be part of this project. So just gonna wait for my slides to come up. All right, so that's me. I'm the Director of Conservation and Research at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And our mission is to conserve California native plants and habitats for the health and well-being of people and the planet. And I hope that through this talk, you'll see why that's important. Next slide. All right, just a slide of background. Insect pollination, who needs it? Well, almost 90% of flowering plants need it. And of course, that's transferring the pollen from the male parts to the female parts. And so transferring genetic material from one individual to another individual. So this cross-pollination, which is effectively kind of keeping them from inbreeding, which we know is bad, this makes these plants more vigorous and more adaptive to change. And of course, both of those things are really important in today's world. So next slide. Also, just from a purely practical standpoint, pollination produces our food, estimated to be worth $18 to $27 billion to us. Just a couple examples, apples, for instance, have to be cross-pollinated. And here's another example is the next image is strawberries, which you can see on the bottom. The nice full plump strawberry on the left has been cross-pollinated. The others have been either self-pollinated or self plus wind pollinated. And I don't know about you, but I want to eat the strawberry on the left. And it's not just European honeybees, which is what most people think of when they think of bees and insect pollinators. I highlighted that these are European species and that they're actually an invasive species that has impacts on our native bees, of which there's about 1,600. So next slide. So bee diversity boosts crop yields. If there's one thing that I can leave you with today is that it takes all kinds, is that biodiversity begets biodiversity. So having a bunch of different kinds of bees can do the job better. And for instance, this study here shows that different bees have different responses to weather, and that together that can stabilize the pollination services. So maybe this one doesn't like high wind and this one doesn't like the cold, but together they're really getting the job done. And in this study, it found that for wild bees, the number of different wild bees was even more important than how many there were. Next slide. Let's not forget about all of the different flowering plants in our wildlands, which maybe we're not eating, but I don't know anybody who doesn't enjoy seeing wildflowers on their hikes. So, and in turn, all of that habitat is supporting those pollinators that pollinate our crops. So it's a nice circle. Next slide. Brief intro to the insect pollinators. It's not just bees, although they're one of the most important pollinators because they go after both nectar and pollen to feed their babies. And they have a lot of structures that really help them carry that pollen. Butterflies can be pollinators, wasps and even ants can be pollinators, flies and beetles can be pollinators. Maybe they're not as good, but maybe they're servicing more flowers and there's more of them. They're more abundant and more resilient. So again, just the point that it takes all kinds. Next. And there's that message, it takes all kinds. If, for example, in California, there's about 1,600 different kinds of California bees, which seems almost impossible to imagine until you really realize that they can be tiny, they can be not that hairy, they can be huge, they can be everything in between. But here's an example, and that's bumblebees. Which are really great pollinators. They are obviously big, they're really hairy. They also have pretty long tongues for a bee, and that means that they can access some flowers that are deeper, that are more complicated, and so achieve pollination that some other species can't. They also have a pretty long active season, so they're real hairy. They can actually do things like shiver and bask in the sun, and this means they can work in cool conditions. Which makes them super valuable for that early time of year. So next slide. Another thing that bumbles can do that's super cool and a few others can do is buzz pollinate. So the image in the middle there shows the anthers of a plant, probably in the Solanaceae family, which you can see aren't covered in pollen. They're only open at the tip. And that means something needs to get that pollen out of that anther, and that's buzz pollination. So you can see in the images that the bumblebee grabs on, and it actually sort of disarticulates its wings from the flight muscles so it doesn't fly away, and then it shakes, which at about the frequency of a musical note of C. And this releases the pollen from those anthers. So you can see this is a pretty special thing. And we have a lot of things that we eat in this family, like tomatoes and also things like blueberries and cranberries also need this kind of pollination. Next. So just to show you a couple pretty pictures to get the point across of the beautiful diversity of different bees. This bee has a real long tongue. Next. And this bee has a shorter tongue, and so it can only access the shallower flowers. But maybe it has hairs in different places. It's different shape. It's active at different times. Next. Bees can be beautiful and colorful. They'll have different shapes and different hair placement. You can see all the hairs on the legs, which are important for transferring the pollen. And this bee will be using different kinds of species. Next. Some bees come in extra large form, like this big carpenter bee. Next. And you can just look at all of that pollen that these bees are carrying. They have these branched hairs and even kind of an electrostatic charge that makes them really good for carrying pollen. Next. But it's not just bees that can carry pollen. This is actually a fly. You might be surprised. It's kind of hairy there. And so it looks like a bee, but this is actually a fly. And I'll just confess that I'm especially in love with fly pollinators. Next. So another example of how it takes all kinds is that insect pollinators range from generalists to specialists. Here's an example of a specialist. So these are squash bees that only use plants in the Cucurbitaceae family. And if you look closely at them, you see that the pollen collecting hairs on their legs are a little sparser than a lot of other bees. And this accommodates the larger pollen grains of the squash and makes them more efficient at carrying the pollen around. Also, they carry that pollen dry versus European honeybees, which make kind of a bee bread with nectar, and they kind of mush it all up together. So the squash bees are actually more effective at carrying that pollen. Next. Okay, so they're important and they're cool, but they are in trouble. Next. Evidence is mounting that insect groups are declining in many parts of the globe. There's evidence from every continent except Antarctica. And just a little science aside here is that it's hard to measure this. It's hard to prove this. But evidence is just rapidly accumulating. There is enough to know that, yes, there is a problem here. We have big headlines like the insect apocalypse. And indeed, we do have some studies that show, for instance, in Germany, a 75% decline over the last 27 years in insect biomass. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember seeing bugs smashed all over your windshield, you don't even need to see this study. You know that you don't see that anymore. And we don't have the bug abundance and biomass that we used to. Native bees, 50% of wild species gone in one study. Butterflies, 50% decline over the last 2 decades. The list goes on. I've got a literature review and I'd be happy to share with any of you. Next. And this has real consequences for us. These are images of people hand pollinating fruit trees. And I don't know about you, but I just don't want it to come to that. And of course, this is expensive for us. And the insects are so well adapted to do this for us. Next. So what are some causes of pollinator decline? There's kind of a long list, and they actually interact with each other. When pollinators are weakened by one thing, they're more susceptible to another thing. I highlighted some of the biggies like habitat loss. I mean, we're just paving over a lot of habitat. It's just they don't have anywhere to live. The habitat that's gone is fragmented, and so it's in smaller patches and just not providing the same amount of resources. We are outright killing them with pesticides. We are transporting them around and introducing new pathogens. We're introducing pollution, including light pollution, which if you imagine yourself being a moth that's traveling around at night, that could be pretty disorienting. We're introducing species from pathogens to competitors like European honeybees to introduced plant species that can be really badly behaved and become invasive and basically displace the diversity of native species that are supporting all these different pollinators. Sometimes we're overexploiting them, big pretty butterflies that we're capturing and selling. Climate change is a big one, which we just heard a lot surrounding the monarchs. And then co-extinction. One thing goes, and if it's tied to another thing, then that thing can go as well. So lots going on here. Next. Native plants and habitats and you are the solution. And if we can do this kind of work, planting native plants and habitats at our homes and doing widespread habitat restoration, we can address the habitat loss, the fragmentation. We can soften our impact in cities. We can, deal with invasive species by planting natives instead of those invasives and restoring diverse native habitat. And we can even have an effect on climate change when we're planting, replacing things with more carbon sequestration. Next. And, this makes sense because native plants and pollinators, they've evolved together. So these are images of columbine flowers, and you can see they have different lengths of what are called spurs for the nectar. And that corresponds to the different length of the mouth parts of these different creatures that pollinate them, which have shifted over time in some cases from bumblebees to hummingbirds to hawk moths, which have the longest mouth parts or proboscis that can reach down into those real long nectar spurs. Next. Bees tend to like native plants better. Again, they take a range of generalists to specialists, and some don't care that much, but a lot do. He found that native plants are 4 times more likely to attract lots of native bees. Again, native bees have not evolved with the exotic plants, but also we've bred a lot of our horticultural plants to have reduced rewards. So maybe we want a bunch more petals on our roses, but that comes at the price of we don't want all of the anthers with all the pollen. Well, that pollen is the thing that these bees are eating. So that's a problem. Next. Let's not forget the butterflies and the moths, which start as larvae. We all know this. We've probably read The Very Hungry Caterpillar and know that, butterflies and moths start as caterpillars. And what do caterpillars eat? Well, they eat plants. And those caterpillars tend to be really specialized, which, as you can imagine, the plants are going to defend themselves, are going to evolve different defenses, and then the caterpillars are going to evolve defenses to get around those, and it's an arms race. And so these things are pretty specialized. So Dr. Douglas Tallamy is one of my heroes. He's written Bringing Nature Home, and one of his studies found that native woody plants support 3 to 14 times the butterflies and moths of introduced species. Next. I just want to slip this in here that floral diversity also attracts beneficial pest control insects. So we're talking about food gardens, food forests. We want to protect all of these plants from, pests getting out of control. And when we have that diversity, we're also attracting all of the things that can keep things in check. Native habitat attracts more beneficial insects, while weeds have been found to have the opposite effect. Next. How can you attract pollinators by creating habitat in your own yard? Here's a set of tips. Next. Strategy 1 is to plant a diversity of native species. So hopefully this follows more everything I've been saying, that diversity begets diversity. It also is providing resilience. Some things going to do well this year with the weather this year, and some things will do better next year. Next. And when you plant them in clumps. So it's good to plant at least like 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. Plant a nice big clump of them for a couple reasons. One is that it's easier for the pollinators to find them. And then the other is once they've found them, then they can stay and be really efficient and just feast. And it's all about energy conservation here. And so efficiency is the name of the game. Next. Strategy 3 is to cover the seasons. Try to have at least 3 different pollinator plants each for spring, summer, and fall. So I just give a couple examples of some beautiful natives that you could plant for spring. You might plant manzanita, some of the earlier bloomers and superstars for pollinators. For spring, summer, you might plant some sages like this purple sage here. And then for fall, there's fewer to choose from, but some superstars like this solidago or goldenrod. Next. Here's just a few examples of a potential planting palette for these seasons. Early spring, you might plant western redbud, different kinds of ceanothus, which is also called California lilac, shown on the right there. Lower middle, chaparral currant, lower left, manzanita. All beautiful, all great for pollinators. Next. And then the summer plant, yeah, I think we skipped one. There we go. Spring, summer planting palette. This has the most to choose from. Sages are wonderful. Bush sunflower, lemonade berry, toyon, buckwheats are superstars for pollinators. Hollyleaf cherry, and then not labeled at the top there on either side is bush mallow, which is also great. Next. For summer, planting palette might include, again, goldenrod. California fuchsia is wonderful, especially good for hummingbirds. Coyote bush is wonderful for not only pollinators, but also pest control insects, and coffeeberry as well. Next. Tip number 4 meshes with what you heard from Charis: avoid pesticides. That's kind of a no-brainer. I know sometimes it's you can't avoid it, but avoid them as much as possible. And urban folk tend to use too much. So we would think that, oh, the problem is really just big agriculture. Well, urban folks are actually almost a bigger problem, because we think if a little bit is good, then more is better. And people use too much, and it runs off, and is really having consequences for our native pollinators. And native bees are even more susceptible than honeybees, which you've probably seen all the dire headlines about, losing half of our hives every year, and colony collapse disorder. Well, native bees are having trouble too, and they're even smaller bodied and more susceptible to all these things. Next. Tip number 5 is to provide nesting habitat. So just like humans, we need not only things to eat, but we need a place to live. And 70% of native bees nest in the ground. So they need to be able to access that soil and dig out these nests. And so they need mulch-free areas. So I know mulch is great for controlling weeds and retaining water, and that's wonderful, but try to leave some mulch-free areas for the bees. The rest tend to use dead trees or stems and twigs and sometimes grasses. So leave the dead stuff, leave the leaves when you can. You can, tidy up the edges so it still looks like a nice, neat garden. But, it's all part of the life cycle there. I know a lot of people are really keen on putting in bee boxes, and it's a cool idea. You can drill these different size holes that are good for different kinds of bees. I would avoid it at home unless you are super committed to following up every year with detailed sort of sterilization, because we have the best intentions, but we can do more harm than good, and we can actually promote pathogens in this way if we're not super careful. Next. Strategy number 6 in the bigger picture is, maybe you don't have a home garden, you don't have that space, you live in an apartment. Support native habitat restoration. Get out there and volunteer and transform landscapes from bare earth or weeds to diverse native plants. You can volunteer for organizations like Channel Islands Restoration, UCSB. They've been transforming North Campus open space from a golf course to 136 acres of diverse native habitat. It's a wonderful success story. Growing solutions, and the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. We have a call out for volunteers right now to help us with a restoration project in the Los Padres National Forest. Next. And other conservation work. So the last story that I wanted to leave you with is next, about a rare plant. We do a lot of work trying to figure out who uses what, so we can do this better. This is the salt marsh bird's beak. It's endangered. It's found in high salt marshes. It's kind of a rare, showy, larger flower. You can see why it gets its name from these pictures here. Next. And this plant is a great example where it needs a larger bee to pollinate it effectively. So you can see the diagram there, how these flowers are kind of closed up. You can see it in the image on the right too. And so it needs a bigger body bee to kind of push its way in and to touch the parts in the right places to transfer the pollen. Next. So larger pollinators like this Melisodes bee are well suited for its pollination. You can see it on top of the flower, muscling its way in. And then you can see all that pollen on it and all of it that it's been gathering on its legs. Other smaller bees can cheat. So not all pollinators are created equally, or flower visitors. This little Lasioglossum or sweat bee can kind of come in the side in these little openings and not really necessarily touch the pollen where it needs to. Next. So we did a study repeating a study from 1985 that studied the pollinators of this rare plant, and that woman, Patricia Lincoln, found 4 different bees using the bird's beak, all 4 pictured here. The one especially most important was the wool carder bee, because it was especially sort of loyal to the bird's beak, and it would repeatedly visit that particular plant, and it was it's a bigger bodied bee and it's effective at carrying the pollen around. So in 2016, we repeated this study, and unfortunately, we found only 2 of these 4 species using the bird's beak, the 2 on the left that I've circled. The bumblebee was not present in our surveys. Even more worrying was that over the course of 15 hours of observation, we found only 5 individuals. That was a particularly bad year for the bird's beak and for a lot of things. So the good news is it wasn't quite as dire the next year that we did that study, but we're having more and more of those bad years, unfortunately. Next. So we looked in that study not only at who's using the bird's beak itself, which is in the lower right picture, but also what other pollinators are using what other plants. And we created this kind of network that shows on the top the different insects and on the bottom the different plants. And in doing that, we were able to identify 2 other plant species that are highlighted in yellow there. There's a phacelia and a deerweed that are also supporting this really important pollinator of the bird's beak, this Anthidium highlighted up top. And these are actually easy to grow. If we planted a ton of those and really supported that Anthidium, we could benefit the bird's beak while we're doing other things to try to recover this rare plant species. So I hope that that example just kind of illustrated how complicated these things can be, and all these little pieces count. Next. So I'm going to leave you with a video on a happier note. This is in some of our studies an endangered bumblebee, Bombus crotchii, unfortunately named, using the bird's beak in 2017. So if you guys could just turn on that video there. This was a better year for the bird's beak. You can see what a pretty flower it is, and what a nice thing it is to watch these bumblebees just shoving their way in there and pollinating these flowers. So it's cool, a rare species supporting another rare species. There's your moment of Zen. Next, last slide. Just I didn't credit a lot of the photographers in this presentation that I just pulled shamelessly off the internet. So I want to thank them all and open it up for questions.
All right, thanks so much, Denise. And I think what people are starting to realize is just how detailed and integrated these systems are, and the fact that the devil really is in the details in terms of not only what species you plant, whether they're native or non-native, the other species that might be supporting that pollinator community. So one question I'll ask you is based off kind of what we know a little bit associated with the native bee species and the European honeybee, and the fact that the European honeybee can basically be an invasive in kind of the natural systems. They're something we very much depend on as kind of conscripted agricultural workers by going out and pollinating our crops for us. Are there examples of, or would people consider, for example, removing European honeybees from areas in order to protect and preserve native bee species?
I think we could consider it, but probably no one would consider it too heavily. I mean, they are important for agriculture. They have been removed in some isolated island systems like Santa Cruz Island, where, it's possible. It's an island. We don't have agriculture going on out there anymore, and you can see the benefits. But I don't see that happening here on the mainland. However, we, rather than encouraging them by, adding hives, we could add habitat that benefits the honeybees and the native bees. So maybe there's other things that we can do to tip the balance a little bit.
And one thing I'll just mention too, that sometimes people run across a situation where they have European honeybees, for example, creating a hive in an area that might not be convenient for them. It might be someplace right next to your house or in a garden, and it's maybe you have people in your family or friends that are allergic. You don't have to kill them or kill their hive to get rid of them. Chances are in your area, you have a beekeepers association, and we're lucky enough in Santa Barbara to have that, and they will actually come out and relocate that hive. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll trap the hive and they'll put it into a bee box, and then they'll place that box on somebody's property who wants to have the bees there for pollination and also for the honey. So there's some kind of more bee-friendly, ecologically friendly ways to relocate honeybee hives should that be a situation. Out of curiosity, I know a lot of people think of honeybees and think of hives. Do you, off the top of your head, know the kind of the percentage of bee species that produce these large social insect hives as opposed to being solitary, like many of our natives?
I don't know offhand the exact percentage, but I know the vast majority of our bees are solitary. The native bees are solitary. There's honeybees are pretty unique, and we think of them as how all bees work, but usually it's just, you know, a solitary bee with its nest and its babies. Sometimes there's kind of pseudo-social relationships. There's all kinds of different forms, and actually this book here is pretty cool, Bees, A Natural History. It goes through all the different kinds of bee biologies, but generally the vast majority of them are solitary.
Uh-huh. And so we did have a question, you know, again, a kind of a practical one, and I can understand where this person's coming from. When you have carpenter bees that are starting to kind of burrow their way into the eaves of your home and potentially cause maybe some level of damage, you suggest it's probably not a good idea to create your own bee nest sites because of the possibility of pathogens. If you wanted to try to attract the carpenter bees away from your home to something else, what might you suggest? Are there ways that you can do that that don't necessarily fall into that trap of potentially doing more harm than good?
Yeah, good question. I don't know about attracting them. There's two things I would say. One is you can just kind of exclude them. You know, you can cover that area with a mesh and just make it so they can't use that area anymore. But I have read actually in this very book I just showed you that what they do is pretty shallow. And so it's not probably going to affect the integrity of your structure so much. So you might consider just kind of letting them be. No pun intended. But yeah, I don't know about creating another structure for them. Again, I worry about the pathogens and think it's better to let them find their own thing.
Yeah. So another question is associated with GMOs and genetically modified crops, especially. And what, you know, can you summarize kind of what we know currently about the effects of GMOs on native bees, native pollinators? Is anything, I mean, I know someone can answer some of that, but I want, you know, you're more abreast of this information than I am.
You know, actually on that topic, I don't feel qualified to say. Okay. You know, there's so much to know with pollinators, especially when you think about all the different kinds of pollinators, not just the bees, but you know, and then the habitat. There's a lot to know and a lot to keep up on, and I don't feel like I have a thorough enough knowledge to even really say.
So I mean, what I have read, you know, and again, somewhat limited, but there have been some studies that have suggested that GMOs for general pollinator diversity are no worse than what we might call the kind of the chemically based agriculture that's out there. So they're not necessarily any worse than agriculture that uses pesticides, but generally an area that is using neither GMOs or pesticides is going to support a higher diversity, as you might expect. There was a lot of concern around genetically modified pollen and its impacts on wild butterfly populations. A fair bit of that has not really played out in kind of the natural ecology as opposed to what they found in the laboratory. And so I think there's still a lot to be done there and a lot to be looked into, but there wasn't seemingly as big of an impact in native natural populations as there was when they saw it in the test they did in the laboratory. And again, one of the other things that's challenging with that type of thing, just as you heard with the monarchs, is there's so many different impacts to an insect population, like for example, migratory monarchs. You know, which one of those things is of greater priority to address in terms of conservation? And I think a lot of people are looking at climate change and habitat protection as still kind of the main ones. And some of these other ones are a little bit more secondary to that. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on probably the GMO issue, especially as they continue to expand, and especially as we start to get new versions of genetically modified organisms, because we have some that are, resistant to herbicides, but we also have some that have genes that are associated with them that make the plant itself into an insecticide. And of course, those are the ones like the BT corn that are of greatest concern when it comes to these non-target insects like some of these pollinators. So my hope is that research continues, but I think it is probably not, neither one of us are probably fully qualified to address that on a large scale. Or
I see a lot more literature on neonicotinoids and their negative impacts, which are varied, including, even just kind of accumulating in the soil where we have ground nesting bees and all kinds of funky effects. It's showing up in honey, and they've been banned in some places, and I think we should consider that here.
Mm-hmm. All righty. So I think what we're going to do is we're at a point now where I think we can also circle back to some of the questions that were asked earlier. And I want to see. So there was one question associated with a program that I thought was interesting. Let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, so this, have you heard of the Mayor's Monarchs Pledge? So this is primarily going towards Charis. And if so, from the list of options to support monarch populations, which do you think are the most beneficial? So I don't know if you've seen that. I haven't. I don't know if you've seen the Mayor's Monarchs Pledge. Sorry, tripping over that name. If there's anything you can say about that.
Yeah, I have heard of it. I haven't looked into it deeply, but I do know that it was created and intended more for the Eastern population, and it's more heavily geared towards planting natives and the issues for the Eastern population. So translating it directly over to the Western population might be a little tricky because of the planting milkweed in specific places isn't across the board like universal as it is in the East. But from what I understand, it can be adjusted, and there's certain goals that the mayors can commit to specifically toward their area, and it just needs a bit more fine tuning. But I think it's a good idea. It's a great way to get cities more engaged in the issue.
Okay. And so that question I posed to you, and again, just thinking what might be coming down the road is, has anybody discussed any possibilities, or is it even possible to reintroduce monarchs to the Western population? We've done, in extreme situations where we've done captive breeding and reintroduction, the California condor, the bald eagle, especially after they've had significant declines that are, human caused, whether it be DDT or lead shot or habitat loss. Given that we're seeing such a drastic decline in the Western monarch population, is that being discussed at all? That are we in a situation where we may have to try to figure out a way to captively breed and reintroduce them? Can you do that and still have migrating monarchs?
Yeah, I think, at this point in the circles in the discussions I've had, there's a whole lot of wild ideas being thrown around of like, what can we do? I don't know if anyone is having serious weight put behind it yet, but some of the crazy ideas is, can we go to Mexico and collect mated females and bring them back and put them in milkweed fields that we know, and can we, monitor that and seed the population back with Mexican or monarchs from Mexico? That idea is interesting and I think has weight, and while the two Eastern and Western populations are genetically similar, there still are some physiological differences between the two populations. The the monarchs that go down to Mexico, they have to fly a much longer distance in their migration. And so their wings are actually larger than the Western monarchs. So, I mean, that's an idea. There's also an idea of artificially triggering the monarchs to go into their winter diapause and like trigger that migration. Can we collect the monarchs and put them in and like cool them down so they get that cool temperature stimulus and then release them? I mean, there's just some wild ideas right now, and I think we are all grasping at the wild ideas to figure out nothing. I don't know what will come to fruition at this point, but I think we need crazy ideas on the table. So
Yep, fair enough.
Yeah.
So another question came through that says, what are the main predators of monarch caterpillars? Are these caterpillars toxic to birds? The observation was that they had 40 caterpillars one week at different stages of age. Next week, all gone. What happens? And I've seen that as well. We find milkweed, a ton of caterpillars. You think, oh, this is great. You come back and wait, they're gone. What happened to them? If they're supposed to have sequestered this cardiac glycoside that helps protect them against predators, is it still predators out doing that and still consuming them? Or is there some other reason why they're no longer on the plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have seen wasps come and systematically pick the caterpillars off the plant and take the caterpillars back to their babies. And some of this is natural. Like I was saying, there's an extremely high predation rate in monarchs, and that's why a monarch female can lay 400 eggs, is because most of them are going to get eaten, and that's kind of an important part of the life cycle. But if all of your okay, so one thing is wasps are a big predator in the Santa Barbara area. So you could put up wasp. Well, I don't know, Denise, what you're going to think about that, but.
See, now you're seeing the competition between which group are you trying to favor? Yeah.
I know, which one? What do you want? You could, if you want to protect your caterpillars on your plant, you could put a net over them to keep the airborne predators off. But then there's also like earwigs will climb up and eat the eggs, and like crickets and a whole bunch of other, well, maybe not crickets, but from that, anyway, Google video surveillance of nocturnal predators, and it lists a whole bunch. Also, the taconid fly, the red-eyed fly, can lay an egg on the caterpillar, and then that egg will start eating the caterpillar, and then the caterpillar will form its chrysalis, and then it will turn black, and instead of a butterfly coming out, you get these little strands of the fly maggots crawling out, which is if you're expecting a butterfly and a maggot comes out,
it's just what a letdown.
Right, but that's also a natural process.
Yep, exactly.
And then also sometimes if your milkweed, or if the female was infected with OE, what can happen is you could see caterpillars that just look weak and then like fall off the plant, and they just die, and that can happen too.
Yeah, and then the kind of the last thing just to keep in mind too, if you see like really big caterpillars and then they're gone, they may have actually crawled off and found another spot to actually form the chrysalis. So they don't necessarily form the chrysalis on the milkweed. They may actually be finding a protected area away from the milkweed to form the chrysalis. So that's something too we found.
Absolutely, and that could be as much as like 30 feet away. They go on this walkabout, and they will go find the perfect place for them to. And in my yard, they loved the top bar of the fence, the cross beam. And so it was just like chrysalis, right along there. I love that. So yeah, so if they're big, if they're the 5th instar caterpillar, then and they leave, let them leave. That's actually what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you're seeing here too is we start to see these dramatic declines. We're going to run into this very challenging set of questions about, do we kind of decrease the populations of one native species in order to support the population of another native species. And sadly, that does sometimes put us in a conflict. And we see that all the time in conservation biology, whether you're looking, especially when you're looking at predators and the things they consume. And it's not a place we want to be, which is why we want to try to promote the healthy populations of all these, so we don't have to make those choices. So back to some of the questions here. It says, if we have a small area to plant, are there plants that might give us a bigger bang for the buck for pollinators? Like, let's say you just have a balcony and a couple of pots. What might be, or do you have some recommendations for like the biggies?
Yeah, totally. So I'm gonna put a link in the chat to the Gardens website. We have a page, Native Plants for Pollinators, and a list, a pollinator plant list for this region. But as far as bang for the buck, buckwheats are amazing, and they're pretty diverse, so there's lots to choose from. Sages are also really amazing. And those are both smaller than, say, a ceanothus or a manzanita, if you're looking for something to put in a pot.
Yeah, and I'll attest to those buckwheats too. They're great. And then the one thing that I think sometimes people don't realize, you got to spend a little time looking close. There's a lot of really little pollinators that are fascinating to see. So even if you're not seeing like large-bodied bumblebees visiting, take a closer look, spend some time, and you'll see some beautiful little flies and small native bees visiting. And sorry, there was a follow-up to that with the monarch one, asking whether, besides wasps and some other things, are there birds that may also be consuming the caterpillars?
Yes, absolutely. I have seen Western kingbirds sit by the monarch cluster and just pick the monarchs off the cluster. And this one time I was counting monarchs out at Elwood, and I found a little cluster. It was in 1990, no, sorry, not 90, 2019. So the population was already small. So I found this little cluster of 10 monarchs and at Elwood, and then a Western kingbird came and ate one, and I was like, 9. Now there's 9.
There's 9. Yeah. I think one of the fascinating things about this whole thing is this arms race between the plant, the monarch, and then the predator, the monarch. So you have the milkweed producing a secondary metabolite, a compound that's toxic, these cardiac glycosides that help defend it against insect herbivores. But then, of course, one of the things that the monarch was able to do was to evolve resistance to that compound. And the fascinating way they did that was to sequester it into its own body tissue as a full compound, making the monarch itself toxic to its predators. It's basically an emetic. If a bird bites, gets a good chunk of a monarch, it'll throw up because it's kind of toxic stuff. But then, of course, the predators of the monarch have evolved ways either to resist the cardiac glycoside, and I've seen some evidence associated with some of the enzymes, physiological enzymes that are associated with the impact of that compound, but also behavioral changes, like they will separate out the different parts of the butterfly or the caterpillar and eat the ones that have the lowest level of the toxin. So it's just a constant back and forth. And at the same time, we're focusing right now on the monarchs and how can we preserve them? But if you step back and you just look at the overall interaction of the species and the ecology, it's really a fascinating story you're watching play out with the monarchs laying their eggs on the milkweed and then moving through that. One thing I found.
One more.
Go. Yeah. Sorry, Charis, go.
Oh, yeah. One more thing about the predators. So there's birds. There's in Mexico. There's a grosbeak that is a pernicious predator of the monarchs. Also, you get small rodents eating monarchs at overwintering sites. So after a storm comes through, it can knock the monarchs onto the ground, and then the mice and rats will eat the monarchs that are on the ground if they haven't had a chance to crawl back up. Most of the time, there's the trees, and then if there's hopefully there's plants underneath that they can crawl back up off the ground and then be protected. But if they can't, or if the mice get them first, then you can get to the monarch site in the morning and just see a pile of just the wings, because the mice will just eat the abdomen of the monarch, and then.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's evidence the populations of rodents actually migrate up into the forests when the monarchs arrive.
Mm-hmm.
Like they know this
Yeah.
massive food resource is arriving, and they actually move in to feed on it. There was some work done too that some of the adult monarch butterflies might actually choose milkweed plants of higher cardiac glycoside levels if they have, I think if it's associated with something, if they have a high level of parasite load, in order to try to benefit their caterpillars. I don't know if you've seen anything about that.
I haven't, but that's really interesting. I've also wondered if different species of milkweed have different levels.
Yeah, and that they have shown even like within, so that, but apparently it looks like the adult butterflies are able to sense somehow, and I don't think they necessarily know the mechanism, the level of the toxicity in the plant, and may actually choose plants of higher levels for some of their to lay their eggs, to benefit their caterpillars potentially, as a way also to fend off some of the parasite.
That's fascinating.
So, I mean, and this is the other thing that I think hopefully everyone's getting from this, is just how much we still don't know. You know, a question I've always asked Charis is like, do we really know how these butterflies get back to the very same locations each year for these congregation sites, you know, and do we have enough, you know, a question for you with regard to the overall health, and it's kind of related to this, is do we know much about the genetic diversity of these populations? Clearly, we're going through a massive bottleneck right now with the Western monarch population. If it were to recover and increase again in population size, it's going to be coming from a relatively small population now that has relatively low genetic diversity, I think. But do we know? Like, do we have any good data on the genetic diversity of these populations?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't think I'm the right person to ask about the genetic diversity, but I am constantly amazed that from year to year, these monarchs find the exact same branch that they used the year before, with having it be 5 generations removed.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've also often gotten a question, well, is it the direct descendant at this site?
Mm-hmm.
And finding that one branch, is there some kind of memory there? And I don't think so, because we know there is a really high rate of movement between overwintering sites, and they are constantly shifting. Is it drier at this site? Is there too much wind? Oh, I'm going to go over here. This one's more protected. This one's moister. I don't have to leave to find resources. I can stay. And oh, this one got a little too cold, so I'm going to go over here. And so we know there's incredible amount of movement. So I don't know that it's like the direct descendant coming to that one spot, but my goodness, that's an incredible area where we could do a lot more research.
Yeah, and I think in general, there's still a fair bit to try to understand about how they orient, you know, both a combination of potential kind of magnetism, Earth magnetic fields, but also things like where the sun is oriented and located as they're moving. And so I think too, there was a request to get your email into the chat somewhere so that people can contact you. So if you drop that in the chat, I think Rachel can put it out for everybody. So another question here is it possible that Western monarch have moved their overwintering location due to climate change? Are researchers just checking the historic overwintering sites, or are they tracking monarchs to find potential new overwintering sites?
Excellent question. And yes. So that first year of the decline, 2018, that was our number one question. Is we were monitoring all of the historic ones, and every year we find new ones. Maybe we get a report of some private land that we haven't had access to, and oh my goodness, now they have monarchs, and let's go count there. So we do get new overwintering sites every year. But historically, we always go back to the historic ones. And so 2018, we're like, well, are they just finding, like all of a sudden finding somewhere else to go? And what is happening, because they were so few. And so we looked, and we would look in canyons and look in other groves of trees, and they weren't there. And so then we realized, well, they're just not anywhere. They're just really low numbers. But Francis Villablanca at Cal Poly, a professor who's taking over the monarch study there, he and his students did a maxent analysis of the climate and topography and all these other environmental factors to see, to find suitable habitat. So they put in the suitable habitat that we know of, and then did a range, and then and it came back pretty similar to what we knew. And then they did it with a climate change model. So they predicted out 20 or 30 years, and they found that the suitable habitat will move north and higher elevation going forward. So then the next question is, well, if they are going to move higher in elevation as it gets warmer and drier in the south, I think we're going to see a range constriction in their overwintering range. I think like 20 years ago, there used to be overwintering and clustering monarchs in San Diego and Baja, and now we're seeing much lower numbers there, even though, and like Monterey and Pacific Grove are seeing higher numbers, or we're still seeing numbers. So I think the overwintering range will maybe constrict, and then if there's suitable habitat, it will move up into higher elevations. Kind of similar to how the monarchs cluster in the mountaintops in Mexico, in the Michoacan mountain range. They're on these mountaintops. So maybe that's what the Western monarchs will emulate then.
So I have a question.
But we are looking in all these places. We're trying. So
searching. Yeah. So everyone's continuing.
We're searching.
And hopefully getting lucky. Yeah. Like one day someone's going to turn a corner and suddenly there's 1.2 million butterflies in one grove somewhere in the middle of California.
Right. And so, the Monarch Mystery Challenge and all these other groups are trying to reach out to hiking groups and birding groups saying, hey, if you just happen to see monarchs in a large group of monarchs in January, let us know, because that's incredibly interesting.
Great. So Denise, a question for you is, as we started to plant more natives and, in the garden at City College, and started to see more of these native bees coming in that weren't there before, because the area that we were planting on was a lawn at one point, they're coming from somewhere. And so it's like, how far will they travel? Do we know, like, how far they'll travel to find this habitat? And part of the question for that is what we do in terms of looking at areas surrounding our gardens or our homes or our neighborhoods to support them on a larger scale. And also, as one of the things we're doing with this SBEE garden project is creating this kind of series of islands, like this archipelago of islands, in hopes that it creates kind of a larger scale habitat for these pollinators, because they can hopefully move to each of these different sites. But do we know at all, like, how far some of these native bees can travel in order to find suitable habitat?
Yeah, it really depends on their body size. They can fly farther if they're bigger. I was just reading honeybees like 5 to 9 kilometers, generally scouting around. So kind of a long ways. The great thing about pollinators is it really seems like if you build it, they will come. They find it. So and pretty quickly, like they respond to habitat restoration within like a year or so. So that's the exciting thing, is that it works, as you've seen. So you asked kind of what can we do around us. There is a study that suggests that if we had just 15% of our landscape as natives, that would be enough to kind of bridge this gap in what you're saying, like the fragmentation. We've got natural habitat over here, and then we've got the city here. Well, if we softened our impact in the city by having like 15% of it be natives, in our homes, in our commercial landscapes, in our parks, then, that can ease that fragmentation. So tell two friends is what you can do.
And so, I mean, for those two that maybe are working or thinking about this on this larger scale, planning out, for example, a lot of us, if you probably have gotten some email from city officials at one point about, here's the 25-year plan for Santa Barbara, or here's, wherever you might live, and inviting people to come in and make comments. Is there any resource or anything that you can think of that they could go to or look at where it shows how you can create these corridors or these kind of archipelagos of habitat islands that can better support natives? And I think it was Eugene, Oregon that had a project some time ago where they were looking at trying to create, in essence, corridors for mobile insect pollinators throughout the city so that they made their city kind of friendlier to these populations and allow them to move. And especially with climate change, the more we allow them to move, the better. So is there anything that people can arm themselves with that might, they could bring to the table if they're sitting around with city staff or city officials and talking about what to do next or how to plan, for example, a 25-year plan for a city?
Yeah, I would love as many advocates for this as possible, because the city is really good at promoting water-wise, but we can do so much better than just water-wise. Native plants are providing habitat too, and so if we could advocate for that, or there's some natives on their website, but it's not prominent, and there aren't enough, and there are conversations, but not enough. And so yeah, let's all advocate for this and have incentives to do more of this. So I guess you asked, what are the resources? And there's a number of resources for kind of how you do it, and I'd be happy if anyone emailed me to send resources that I have and links and things. But I do want to see our governments getting more involved to really incentivizing this.
Mm-hmm. And we'll post some of those resources as well on our website. And I know Denise has put together quite a good list of native flowering plants and when they flower and what color their flowers are, that I know we're following for some of our gardens, so that you can try to get to that point where we have a great diversity of flowers, flower types, and also getting that full span across the year to provide a food resource for the entire year for the native bee population. And the other thing, just for the people that are kind of joining us, botanic gardens can be great places too to buy plants. And I know the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden sells native local genotype species. And we're lucky enough in Santa Barbara too to have other sources. I source a lot of our plants in our gardens from Island Seed and Feed in Goleta, and they get a lot of their plants wholesale from Santa Barbara Natives, which does both ecological restoration work and also grows a lot of the native species from local genotype seeds. So you can, if you do a little bit of homework, you can usually find a nursery or a botanic garden near where you live that is going to specialize in native species and potentially even native genotypes. And they tend to be a wealth of knowledge in what might work in your area. And the other thing that we're hoping to do and using resources in the community is to put together a little bit more fine-grained list of both native and food-producing plants that work in some of our specific microclimates. So for example, City College is, on the mesa. We're going to have a different microclimate due to things like coastal fog than someone that might live, in the foothills. And that's another thing to consider when you're kind of planning your garden out, is you may have a different microclimate, different soil type, different sun exposure, even in a relatively short distance. So for the both speakers, is there any final lasting thoughts you want to leave with everybody as we tie things up in the next couple of minutes? I know I just put you on the.
I'll say
on the spot.
something.
Yeah.
Something I wish I had put as a tip in my list was get involved with community science. So, you know, we can, like I said, a lot of what we do is just learning more about who's on what are these networks, and how can we support who we want to support in our farms and home landscapes and things. So getting involved in community science, there's a number of things, you know, helping gather data, on the different bees, like Bumblebee Watch as an example. There's the Great Sunflower Project, just observing these creatures, getting involved with iNaturalist, which if you can take a good enough picture, someone will tell you who this thing is. And you can go one step further. You can join a group that my friend and colleague created called the California Pollination Project. So you take a picture of a critter on a plant and you actually post it twice. Once for the plant and once for the pollinator, and you know, give information to link them, and then we can learn more, not only about where these species are, but who's using what, and really kind of go a little deeper into this to kind of rebuilding habitat.
Yeah, and I'll put another plug out for that iNaturalist process because it's actually a lot of fun. There's a huge community of professional scientists and amateur scientists on there. And one of the great things about it is they will tell you what it is you're seeing if you don't know what it is, and you'll get a lot of responses to that. And people get really excited about new stuff. There's also Seek, which is a component of iNaturalist, where that is an app that you can use that with your camera on your phone, if you take a, you know, hover it over a plant or something else, it'll actually tell you with reasonably good accuracy what it is you're looking at. So that's a, you know, kind of having your own kind of scientist on your shoulder telling you, you know, what this plant is when otherwise you may not know. It actually can do that for you. And we'll try to put as many of those links to on the Explore Ecology website for these various citizen science type projects, you know, iNaturalist, Bumblebee Watch, a number of others that are really good both for you to get information, but also because these are massive data sets and there's just so much more area that we can cover when we employ general citizens, you know, general community, because there's only a limited number of biologists and their time to try to run around and see all this stuff. All right, Charis, what do you got for us?
Okay, because monarchs are so rare right now in California, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has suspended their any tagging program and handling of monarchs. And so just to prevent any further harm coming from the monarchs so that's just something to keep aware of if you're active with monarchs in your yard. Also, if you are handling them, like bringing them inside, maybe don't, but then also make sure that your equipment is really sterile so you're not transporting OE or any other pathogens and doing more harm than good. And then I loved what Denise said is get involved in citizen science. And so the first one that comes to mind is, well, the Monarch Mystery Challenge. Help us understand where the monarchs are and when. And then Monarch Alert at Cal Poly has a garden survey that you can participate in to tell them what species of milkweed do you have. And then there's a monarch larval monitoring program, MLMP, that has you go out weekly and count the caterpillars and the eggs and the different instars that you have, and then so that we can track what's happening where. So there's so much to do and get involved in.
Great.
Thank you for your interest. Yeah.
All right, you guys. Well, thank you again for joining us. Thank you so much, Denise and Charis, for this information and giving us kind of the up-to-date information and also some very applicable aspects to this to get out and do something in our own backyards. I hope everybody got a lot out of this. We tried to be efficient and informative. And again, just a reminder, we will have all of this posted on the website as a YouTube video. I think, Clyde, you can put up that last slide again, just so that everybody can see that. Thank you. So you will also get just a very brief survey about the event experience. We really appreciate that everybody filled out the Google form, and we'll also do this because that helps us report back to the EPA about the project, and that's good for them, it's good for us, especially as we apply for other grants down the road. So I think, look at that, we pulled it off. We got just about right on time. So we'll let you all go, and definitely there's some great events coming up. Xerces Society has another great talk coming up tomorrow on the insect apocalypse. You can look on their website, plus all of these amazing webinars and virtual events associated with Earth Day. The Community Environmental Council is doing a lot of those over the next few days. So enjoy it, get out there, get involved, take this information, do something with it, get involved with citizen science, and take a look at our website. We'll continue to put new stuff on there. We're going to have more talks coming down the road, and we'll try to get all of these various links and resources that we mentioned here today posted there, so you have access to those. And our contact information is there as well. So if you have any questions for us, the speakers, for those of us with the project, feel free to send us an email. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Enjoy your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.